Good afternoon. This is the Diplomacy series that we have. We are doing this especially for some groups of our students at the Diplomatic Academy and also for the public. I will introduce the topic Russia and Europe after the Corona crisis with some basics, just to remind us of what we are talking about. Russia and the European Union are the closest trade partner you can imagine. This has been true for quite a long time, and if just start with a few of the data, Russia is the #4 trading partner for the European Union, and for Russia, about almost 50% of Russian trade goes to the European Union. As far as energy is concerned, 70% of the imports from Russia to Europe are energy products. So it is very clear that there is a strong economic interdependence between Russia and the European Union. Let's start with the basics on the Russian side before I will say a few words about the consequences of COVID-19. The basics are very obvious, and when you read the analysis of the position of Russia on a global scale, you immediately find, first of all, Russia is the largest country globally. Russia has all these natural resources, which makes it partly independent from other parts of this global order. Russia is the second largest nuclear power. The military strength of Russia is shown not only inside Russia, but as we all know, also outside Russia. And Russia has a strong multilateral position with its permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council, and also its activities in other international arena, and Security Council decisions are, as we all know, still quite important. So these basic characteristics of Russia are not changing. But what are the basic characteristics on the European Union side? The basic characteristics are, as we all know, that the governance of the European Union is quite complicated. It has been quite complicated for some time. And at the moment, there are challenges which are special for the European Union. The first challenge which we should mention here is certainly Brexit and the exit of the United Kingdom of the European Union, and we all still do not know whether it will be a hard exit at the end of this year or whether there will be an extensive trade deal, or at least partly a trade deal, which will help us to avoid some of the negative economic consequences. The second challenge for the European Union certainly is the governance itself. It becomes clear that there is an inner division within the European member states between East-West and North-South, which comes up whenever a crisis appears on the European horizon. This has been the case certainly with the debt crisis and the Greek crisis in 2010, 2011, but especially also with the refugee crisis 2015, 2016. And lately, with the growing crisis between the Western European members and countries like Poland and Hungary about the rule of law and the democracy in these countries. So the power of the European Union on a global scale is dependent on a lot of these internal questions the European Union has to ask itself, but also of the external constraints we are experiencing. And for the European Union at the moment, one of the challenges, strong challenges, is the question, what will be the future of the transatlantic relationship, the relationship with the United States? And we all know that it is very hard to predict what the tweets of Mr. Trump in this context may really mean, because one example, like just from the last days, within 24 hours, the president of the States changed fundamentally his view on the fact whether he needs an expert group for the COVID-19 crisis, which should be terminated now, or whether it should be indefinitely. And the latest I have heard, at least, was that he has now meant that it should be an indeterminate working group on this. So this transatlantic relationship, which depends on these issues, is also something which is very much in the unclear for the coming period. So one could say, if we look at this, in the relation between Russia and the European Union, Russia is in a better position than the European Union, because the basics of Russia have not been changing over the last years. So it has, one has the impression that also the political situation in Russia is a stable one. And just one example, the fact that the Kremlin and President Vladimir Vladimirovich personally is deciding that the constitution needs to be changed. The Yeltsin constitution of the 1990s need to be changed, has been accepted by both houses of the Duma, of parliament, and should actually by now already be in place. But the referendum, which was planned for 22nd of April, has been delayed now because of the COVID-19 crisis. But in general, you could say this is a proof that the Kremlin system is quite politically stable, and the power structures within Russia are not about to change so much. And as I said, on the European Union side, it is not clear which way the governance system and the whole structure of the EU will go. So one could say, at least before this COVID-19 crisis, that Russia is in a better position as far as political power is concerned in this global arena than the European Union, in spite of the fact that the Russian economy is still very much dependent on energy, and especially on oil and gas, and in spite of the fact that sanctions which have been imposed by the Western world in various degrees is still detrimental for the financing of the Russian industry, and also for as far as the movement of some of the leading personnel of Russia is concerned to the rest of the world. And this has been actually prolonged also by the European Union. And as you know, that every half a year that this prolongation is continued, and it is very likely that the next continuation in June will also be accepted by all EU member countries. So the notion that we have a system which is quite stable in the relations between Russia and the European Union, although on a very low level and with not much trust, is quite a stable one. And now we have the crisis. What do I think that this crisis may change in this system? And will it change anything? That's the issue here. Well, let me start with my main thesis. My main thesis is really that it will not be a game changer. COVID-19 will not be a game changer, but possibly a fire accelerator. What do I mean by this? I mean that some of the major trends in the relations between Europe and Russia, which go in a direction that it will be hard to overcome the distrust and the problematic situation at the moment, will even get worse after this crisis. Why do I think this is the case? I'll give you a few of the characteristics of this. First of all, and maybe this is the most important one, it is not very likely that the main constraint that we have for improving bilateral relations between the EU and Russia, which is the annexation of Crimea and the conflict in eastern Ukraine, will go away as the main constraint in these relations. It's not very likely that the Western side, and especially the European Union, will have a different position on this constraint on improving relations than it had before. It may look likely for some of you, and we can discuss this, because at the beginning of this crisis, there were some attempts in the eastern Ukraine to have a ceasefire, to continue with the exchange of prisoners, and so on. But at this very moment, there is no indication that either the Minsk process nor the situation on the ground in eastern Ukraine will change. And because of the fact of this global COVID-19 crisis, that it will not be the fact that this conflict will go away as the main constraint in improving our relation. The second point is actually, I said at the very beginning, that the major element of our relations is business, is the economic relations, is the trade relations. And this will also not change. Russia has been talking for a long time about diversifying its trade relation, trying to improve the trade, but also the energy relations with China, trying to get to some understanding with the Trump administration, and trying also to get more also economic clout in Africa or even in the Arab world. It is not very likely that after this crisis, Russia will be in a better position to really modernize its economy and reduce its dependency on energy relations. And if this is not the case, if they're still relying on natural resources and energy, then the relations with Europe will still be the most important one. And actually will be maybe more difficult because the volatility of the oil and gas price will be stronger after that, what we see already now, than it was before. And just remind you of the fact that there was an attempt immediately before the crisis hit Europe to reduce production of oil, not only in the OPEC countries, but also with Russia. And Saudi Arabia and Russia tried to have a deal. It failed in Vienna, by the way. I think it was beginning of March. And then Russia realized, but also the OPEC, that this is necessary to keep the oil price as high as possible. Then they had an agreement with Trump, and Mr. Trump telephoned with Mr. Putin, I think once or twice, making this sure. But even this did not help because of the reduction or the expected reduction of demand for oil and gas, and the price was down as much as never expected before, which meant that for the Russian economy, there is little leverage on this side of the economic equation that we have between Russia and the European Union. And it's not only the economy which will be more difficult for Russia, and there will be the difference, because one major element is the question, how much are governments trying to come out of this crisis, which is economic crisis following the COVID-19 situation, pandemic. And you can see the expectation is it will not change, that the European Union countries are spending much more public money and spending much more concerted efforts through the European Central Bank on bringing not only money, but also directly investing into the economy, in the European economy, to come out of the crisis again. And yesterday, there was the data from Brussels about the GDP decrease that they expect for the EU member countries for this year, the coming year. And you can see actually that by the end of next year, the general expectation is that in EU member countries, there will only be a small reduction comparing to the 2019 figures. Whereas on the Russian side, if we go there, so far at least, the central bank in Russia and also the government has not invested a lot of money into saving the business sector in Russia. And actually, if you compare the figures that the Russian government so far has committed to the crisis, the economic crisis, it's not much more than Austria alone has already committed to resolving the economic crisis. This will change, certainly. Russia will have to invest more, but the policy is, and there are official statements already from the Russian side, that they do not want, if possible, will not want to reduce the wealth reserves that they have, the national reserves that they have, of about 154 or something billion dollar for investing into the Russian economy. They will have to use quite a lot of this, but if economic policy stays like it is now, it is very obvious that the European side will get out of the economic crisis better than the Russian side, because the Russian side is at the moment at least trying to rely not on pumping so much money into the Russian economy. The second point is why I think the European side will get out stronger than the Russian side, but still it will not be a game changer. Has to do with reputation and reputation management. On the European Union side, you can see that what social scientists expected and political scientists expected, that those leaders in European Union member countries, which were quite strong, strict, clear, and unequivocal about the reactions to the crisis, have more support in the population than they had before the crisis. Austria is a good example. Our present prime minister never had such a positive reputation scale in the Austrian population than he has now at this very moment of the crisis. And the same is true for a lot of the leaders in European Union member countries. And only there are exceptions to this, only where there was a change in strategy regarding the COVID-19 crisis. Also, the leadership question is reputation-wise in a problem. Boris Johnson will get some problems because of the change of strategy they did, or which is supposedly they did. And maybe in Sweden, there will be a similar problem for the reputation of the government like that. But overall, you get a very positive response, even in countries like Spain and Italy. The prime ministers get quite an increase in the popularity rating, although of the high numbers of death, COVID-19 deaths, for instance. But what is the situation on the Russian side? On the Russian side, and that's the most interesting thing, you have a historic low of the approval rate of President Putin. The figures that I got yesterday was only 59% of the population approves of the president. That sounds a lot. It's more than Trump gets regularly. He would be glad to have a 59%. But for in a Russian counting, and we have figures for at least the last 20 years, there was never such a low approval rate since Putin became president, only at the very beginning in the year 2000 possibly. Why is this the case? The explanations you have in political science have to do with the fact that there is not as much political stability in the Russian system than one would expect. Than what it looks like when you look into figures like election results, like participation of civil society, when you look at all these popularity ratings of the Kremlin people and also of the trust in institutions like the military and so on. Some people explain this by the fact that in the Russian tradition, political structures can look very stable, but there is a revolutionary moment which is always possible in spite of the perception of being very stable. Possibly this is true, so this is one of the reasons why the reputation level is low. Secondly, the explanation by political scientists would be that the system is not as efficient, the Russian system, as the democratic system in Western Europe, because it had less possibility of including civil society actors, including checks and balances, and in a situation of crisis, this becomes a problem for the leadership. This may be very well the case, and it may be that now with this obvious increase also of the figures of infection in Russia, yesterday or today, it was already 11,000 new infections, and Russia is now, as far as the number is infections is concerned, is already number 5 globally and has passed France and Germany already, and the numbers are still growing. it may be that the lack of efficiency in dealing with the crisis it has also to do with the loss of reputation of the president and also of the system overall. And the third part is certainly the health system issues. But the health system issues, we will have to see whether the Russian system can really cope in all regions, and especially in Moscow, where you have half of the infection causes, as well as at least in major parts of the European Union. So there is this possibility that this will depend on the next few weeks and months, that the political system in Russia will have a real problem in acceptance, something that you would not have expected without the COVID-19 crisis. So with these two elements, that there is a different economic reaction to the crisis between the EU and Russia, and the idea that the political stability may be different, then we have to ask finally, what does this mean for security relations between the EU and Russia? What does it mean for the foreign policy issues between EU and Russia? And I already talked about the trade relations and the interdependence in trade and energy especially. So let's go to security. I would say my main thesis about not a game changer, but the fire accelerator is most clearly, can be most clearly seen. Because what was the first reaction on both sides, EU and Russia, on the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis? On the EU side, we, the European Union and its institutions, immediately found out that there was a lot of fake news coming, as was said, from Russian sources, trying to make use of the situation to say that this is a proof that Europe is not working, Europe is in a crisis. The situation, especially at the beginning, Italy, was out of the hand, and that Russia had actually to help Italy, as it did, with medical support and even with some direct contacts between Prime Minister Conte and the President Putin. And this was put all over the all Russian state media and also on social media. And the European side had only recently a report published which said that Russian and Chinese social media activities are trying to attack the Russian reaction to the COVID-19 crisis and sometimes even want to create some sort of political instability, by the way, they deal with this situation. So that's something we expect, actually, the relations nowadays, because you had it with every European elections, with every election in a European member country. There was always this notion that the Russians, or some Russians, whatever you call them, trolls or hackers or social media activists, were involved in trying to destabilize the situation in Europe. So it was not surprising. It also happened with the COVID-19 crisis. On the other side, on the Russian side, you have for some time quite similar fake news attempts, also on Russian state media, talking about the responsibility also of the Europeans, and mainly saying that Europe is a system which cannot work in a state of crisis, and that Russia is much better prepared for such a global crisis than the European Union. Certainly now, with the figures rising so strongly in Russia, this sort of narrative is not working as much as it used to work. And going with this also, the old notion of spheres of influence that are so important in the political relations between Europe and Russia, something that you can go through the centuries has been an important issue of how Russia and Europe tried to make good relations, is also coming up with the crisis again. The best example is certainly the situation in the Western Balkans, in Southeastern Europe. There was a competition in March and April about who is actually supporting better the Western Balkans at the beginning of the crisis? Was it Russia or China, or was it the European Union? And the European Union at the beginning was not communicating much help because, as we all know, in these situations, the European Union has a governance system which takes a long time. It takes much longer than if the Kremlin wants to decide something, or Beijing wants to decide something. So it was not surprising that the first help that was also narrated and presented on social media and on television was Russian and Chinese in countries like Serbia, but also other countries. And actually, there were these pictures on Serbian state television where the Serbian President Vučić kissed the Chinese flag and thanked the Russians for the support they gave with medical products and with help in this crisis. And only later on, the European Union communicated its help, which is actually, in fact, much bigger and much more consistent than the Russian one. So what's going on there? It's this sort of old ideas of we have to make sure that these areas are or can be our spheres of influence. And this notion of spheres of influence in the Russian European context is not only about the Western Balkans, but it is certainly about all these countries between Russia and the European Union, what in our context we call the Eastern Neighborhood Program, Eastern Neighborhood countries, which is an area where there is an obvious competition about the spheres of influence, which is seen in a different way from both sides. For the Russian sides, it's the post-Soviet space where they feel they have a right to have a sphere of influence. And from the European side, we are saying that we are offering them cooperation and asking them to make decisions on their own. The story is really the very difficult relations that we have had for quite some time, actually since the mid-2000s, about mid-2000s, after 2005-06. This negative story will not end after the COVID crisis, but it may be the case that it will be even increased because of different consequences for both sides of the COVID crisis. It looked, the very first 2 months of this crisis, that the consequences for the European Union side will be much more deeper and drastic than for the Russian side. But this is now, the balance is now going to the Russian side with the increased numbers, with the problems they have, as you see, as I said, in the popularity of the president. And because of this situation, and because of the expectation also on the European side, how the Russian system is reacting in these sort of crises, one of the possible outcomes will be that we might see a Russian interest by at least some parts of the leadership in Russia to use again foreign policy as a weapon for positioning on the global scale. Nobody expects that this will be a direct confrontation with the West or NATO or the European Union, but Russia may have an interest to be a spoiler again in other parts of the world, more than it was before this COVID-19 crisis. It's not something that I would politically want, but it's something, if you analyze the situation, is not so unlikely. And what about the European Union side? What I said is actually the European Union is stuck. It's stuck in the fact that it is having these sanctions vis-a-vis Russia. It is having this declaration that the illegal annexation of Crimea and the conflict in eastern Ukraine have to be solved before the relations can improve. And this will also not change because of the COVID-19 crisis. And these few attempts at the beginning of the crisis to get some breakthrough in the Ukraine have not been successful. And at the moment, there is no real attempt to do this. So both sides may be in a position after this, after the end of the pandemic, to say that actually we are in a different position. But both sides may say there's not a time for improving the relations. But at the same time, economically, as I said at the very beginning, interdependency will not decrease. Whatever the oil price is, and whatever decisions on things like the pipeline from Russia to Germany, Nord Stream 2, or other pipelines will be. So you have a constant need for this relationship, but you have at the same time proven by this crisis so far a situation where even ruptures like such a pandemic is not changing the general notion of this relationship. So maybe I should stop here before maybe in the questions I try to give also some positive outlook on what may be possible of this crisis. But I wanted to start with saying the trends that we have may even get worse in the relationship because of the different consequences of this crisis.